or if you any technical problems, or if you get chucked out, just follow the link to get back in, and Jules will help you with that. So I'm going to give just a very brief introduction to Thomas, that many of you will know Thomas. Thomas is a psychiatrist, a writer, and an academic. He's the author of several books. Let's see, I've got here, what have I got? I've got The Secret Life of the Unborn Child here, which was which I think is one of the first books really that dealt with the secret life of the life of the unborn child from the unborn child's perspective. And it was certainly a book which I read many years ago and was a big influence on me. So thank you, Thomas, for that. I've also got here Pre-Parenting, Nurturing Your Child from Conception. Again, a really wonderful book. Thomas, I didn't say that I was going to mention this, but you're also a poet, and you've produced this wonderful book of poems. Very impressive. I was looking through them, and they're really some very lovely poems in there. And then we're going to be talking mainly about your book, The Embodied Mind. So as you have a really extensive academic background, and you also helped to found the Association of Pre and Perinatal Psychology and Health, the American Association. You were its president for 8 years, and you also have been the editor-in-chief of the journal. So it's a real pleasure to welcome you, because you really are one of the pioneers in this work that many of us are now involved in. Many of the people who are attending are involved in. So I'd like to hand over to you, Thomas, if I can hear you.
Yes, you can hear me, and thank you for having me on your program.
It is a real pleasure. And we've, like I say, your book was a major influence on me. So I'm blaming you for what I'm doing with my life now, but with appreciation. And we first met in 2019 when you came over to the Human Being Conference.
Right.
At that stage, you presented a lot of the work which has gone into the embodied mind. I remember being really bowled over at the time just by the breadth and depth of the research you were presenting there. But I'd like to just step back a little bit, and I'm really curious about how you moved from being a psychiatrist, first of all, to getting into this whole field of pre and perinatal psychology. What led you in that direction?
All right. Well, to be absolutely 100% correct, I would have to go back to my prenatal days, but I think that would probably take a little longer than what we have the time for. So I will just go back to when I was a young psychiatrist, and I was very interested in dreams. And there's a story to that too, but perhaps we'll leave that for the moment. I was very interested in dreams. And so very often with my patients, I would be discussing their dreams. And one of my patients, in the midst of discussing his dream, suddenly started crying like a little baby. And I did not interfere with him in that. And after about 10 minutes, he came out of it, so to speak. And I asked him what had happened. And he said that he had just found himself as a little baby in a crib, crying for his mother. And then he said, being a somewhat skeptical young lawyer, he said, you know, there's something wrong with this picture, this experience that I just had, because the crib that I just found myself in was white. And I have actually seen, he said, photographs of myself as a baby in a blue crib. So this doesn't quite make sense. So I said to him, go home, speak to your mother. He was still a young man. His parents were still alive, and see what she says. So he did. So next week, the following week, he came back for his regular appointment. And he told me, this is really amazing. But it seems that the first few months of my life, my parents did not have enough money to buy me a crib. And they borrowed a crib from a neighbor, and that crib was white. And only a few months later, somehow they managed to buy me a crib, and that crib, because I was a boy, was blue. Now, he had no idea, nobody ever told him about this before. So when I heard that, sort of a light bulb went up in my mind, and I thought, how is this possible? As you did not mention, so I will say, I went to some pretty good schools. I studied medicine at the University of Toronto. I went to Harvard University, and I was always taught that children before the age of 2 don't remember anything. So this was impossible. This just could not have happened. But it happened. It was right there in my office. This guy did not make it up. Well, but like I said, because I was so well educated, I, of course, I believed my books and not my patient. And so what is interesting is that a few weeks or months later, more incidents like that started to happen in my life. And just as an example, for example, I heard on the radio an interview with Boris Brott, who was a very, very well-regarded conductor in Canada. And at the end of the interview, I guess the interviewer ran out of questions. She said to him, well, Boris, when do you think your musical career started? And he said, it started in my mother's womb. Well, of course, big upset. What do you mean? What do you mean? How is that possible? So he said, well, it seems that when he was a young conductor, and he was conducting a piece that had a cello line in it, before he even changed the page, he somehow knew, although he had never studied it before, what the following notes would be. So when he noticed that, he went home, spoke to his mother, and she said, well, what are the pieces that seem sort of familiar to you? And he told her, and she said, well, she was a cellist, and those were the cello pieces that she practiced while she was pregnant with him. So, like I said, when 2 or 3 of these things started happening to me, then I met an obstetrician, a very well-known obstetrician in Canada, had dinner with him, and I told him about that, told him about these incidents. And he said, totally disbelieving it, but meaning well, he said, well, in a couple of months, there is a huge psychosomatic obstetrics and gynecology conference. It's a world conference, happens every 4 years in Rome. Why don't you present a paper on this? So I did. I sent in my paper. I called it The Psychic Life of the Unborn Child. And lo and behold, it was accepted. I was like a totally unknown young psychiatrist. And so not only was it accepted, but actually it was put on the morning program with people like R.D. Laing, for example, who I'm sure you know, or know of. So I presented my paper, 20 minutes I was given, and towards the end of it, I noticed that there was this real excitement there were about 500 people in the audience, and they were really, really excited about what I was talking about. And so I said, if anybody wants to continue talking about this with me, please come to my room at 5 o'clock. And I gave them the room number. Well, at 5 o'clock, there was this huge lineup of people in front of my room. And R.D. Lang came, and lots of the leading lights of psychosomatic obstetrics came. I got to know R.D. Lang, Ronnie, quite well. And so having had that experience then gave me the impetus to start writing the book, which then later became The Secret Life of the Unborn Child. I sent it in to Simon & Schuster. They did not like the idea of the psychic life because it sounded too California, too off the wall. So then it became The Secret Life of the Unborn Child. And that, of course, then became incredibly successful. It's now published in 28 countries, and it continues to be published and republished. But coming back to your question, what I could explain at the time that I was writing The Secret Life of the Unborn Child, what I could explain, satisfying my curiosity and my scientific bent of mind, what I could explain how children, perhaps from the end of the second trimester, had the neurological capacity to remember things that happened to them in the womb. And there's a lot of research, of course, I'm sure you're familiar with it, that supports that. But then, every once in a while, I would hear people describe memories, experiences that went back further in their life, went back right to conception. And I could not explain that. And that bothered me. And then about 9 years ago, I read in one of the scientific papers, which I sort of read every day. I read in once in a scientific paper and in a journal about a Frenchman, 44 years old, who developed a weakness in his left leg. And he went to see his physician, and they did all kinds of studies, including taking an X-ray of his skull, of his head. And to everyone's incredible surprise, they found that he had virtually no brain tissue. He had a thin crest of brain tissue, cerebral cortex, and the rest was fluid, hydrocephalus, as they call it in medical science, hydrocephalus. Mm-hmm. Now, this was a 44-year-old man. He was gainfully employed in the French civil service, which may have something to do with the French civil service, but that's neither here nor there. He had 2 children. For all intents and purposes, he was a well-functioning, normal human being. And I thought to myself, how is this possible? How is it possible that a person with virtually no brain can function so well? And so that's when I started 9 years ago. That's when I started trying to find some way of explaining that. And so I read and read and read, and gradually I put together a very good case, a very good scientific case for the hypothesis, which I'm putting forth in my book, The Embodied Mind, that really the brain is not separate from the rest of the body, which is what so many neuroscientists have sort of implied. And they sort of work on the premise that the brain is supreme and the rest of the body is just kind of, the servant of the brain. And I found that every tissue and every cell and every organ in the body contributes to our cognition and to our mind. And so that's how I understood the fact that memories really are also in the rest of the body, in all the cells working together like one supporting network, which is really very much like the internet and very much like computers are built nowadays. It's all about concrete, separate cells working together. And of course, the unity of those is much greater than the individual parts. So the way I see it is that really the body is like a backup system to the brain. You need the body and the brain for us to be truly human.
One of the terms I enjoyed that you used in the book, I think I've got this right, is cerebro-centric. There's a cerebro-centric perspective in science.
Yes, yes. Well, you know, this goes back hundreds of years. It's really part of our Western civilization. We have lived for centuries in a very patriarchal system. Patriarchal system is hierarchical. It's always the chief, the head of the family, the chief of the tribe, the king, the counselors to the king who were always male. So this whole idea of the head and the brain being supreme has been sort of inbred in us for centuries culturally. And that has been adopted by science. It has been adopted by medicine. You know, we live in this world where science really believes, you know, that in determinism and materialism. And I think that does not serve us well as human beings. It is totally antithetical to a more humanistic and spiritual way of being. And so that's one of the underlying concerns in my book, that we, you know, materialism and determinism have really sort of undermined our understanding of what human beings should be all about.
And certainly when I read your book, one of the things that struck me is what you are doing is you're presenting the science which really supports those of us who work directly with the body in therapy, because the, you know, we experience these things directly in the therapy room.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, so true. And then, you know, there's the whole problem of the mind. Like most scientists, with very few exceptions, you know, see the mind as kind of an epiphenomenon, which is a big word for a function. Okay, so they see the mind as a function of the brain, an epiphenomenon of the brain. They liken it, and I think this really sort of stops the cameras. They liken it, let's say, to the kidneys producing urine. So urine is a function of the kidneys. Now, what could be more different from urine than the mind, really? You know, I mean, just think about it. It makes absolutely no sense to equate the mind with something material that you can measure and look at and calibrate and all the other things that science loves to do with urine. So the mind is something totally abstract, totally different, and we need a different way of looking at it than the scientific determinism and materialism.
And one of the things you refer to is post-materialistic science.
Yes.
And I really appreciated that as a term. And my sense is that there is an emerging paradigm. You know, what you're presenting is there is so much evidence now, which is emerging from serious researchers like yourself, people with good academic backgrounds, as well as you know, those of us who are working in therapy.
Sure.
yeah, I'm curious if you'd like to say something about that, this emerging paradigm, how you see that and how you see it in relationship to, let's say, the dogmas that exist within the materialistic paradigm.
Yeah, it's very hard. It's very hard to move scientists, academics, into looking at their science or the world or the human psyche in a way which is different from what they learned at university.
Mm-hmm.
Like so many people, and perhaps there must be some amongst our viewers here today, so many people, once they learned something at university, and of course, they looked up to their professors. The professors always come across as sort of semi-gods to students, right? We know that. We have had that experience ourselves. So once they have learned something, they are really not very likely to change their minds. In fact, they will resist any knowledge or any hypotheses that go against their accepted sort of belief system. So, I had that problem when I published The Secret Life of the Unborn Child, when, most obstetricians, for example, were like totally opposed to it, totally opposed to it. And the animosity that, I was exposed to was really quite severe. It was not pleasant. So interestingly enough, by the way, this book has not produced the same kind of resistance. So, perhaps things are changing. Like I had many more, I was the subject of many more sort of personal attacks in the 1980s for The Secret Life of the Unborn Child than today with the Embodied Mind. So perhaps that bodes well for the future.
Well, there was a particular passage in the book.
Yes.
I'm going to quote you back to yourself, which
please do.
I appreciated. This was in chapter 10, where you write, "I believe that only through the relentless scrutiny, questioning, and challenging of orthodoxy can science progress." And I think that's just such an important statement there, that actually it is through scrutiny, questioning, that actually, I mean, that is the essence of science.
Yes, it is. But scientists forget about that.
Yeah. And I imagine it takes a certain amount of courage to actually actually step into challenging that.
Well, yeah, it's also very difficult to get it published because there is so much resistance. Publishers are sort of a strange kind of breed, because on one hand they want something new, but not too new.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like,
right.
don't upset the apple cart. Okay. So it's very difficult to write something new which is not really new. And also, they have got their own readers and scientists who usually, if, like in my case, because, I'm fairly well known, it would go to like some high-ranking academic whose knee-jerk reaction is to immediately oppose it because it's not part of his knowledge system, right? Mm-hmm. So it wasn't that easy to get this book published because of the resistance to these new ideas. But I was, I persisted, and I had a good literary agent, which, by the way, is also difficult to find nowadays. Because the publishers use the literary agents as sort of their readers. So instead of having a reader in a publishing house, they get their literary agents to do the reading. If the literary agent thinks it's not a good book or it won't make money, maybe a very good book, but it won't won't make a hoard of money, then they just don't pass it on to a publisher. So you have to jump through a lot of hoops in order to get published. Scientists are like the rest of us, I guess, loath to new ideas. There are very few people like you yourself, Matthew, thank God, who are open to new ideas. And the 100 people perhaps who are watching this, God bless them, because they are watching it because they too are open to new ideas. Otherwise, they would not be on this podcast. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, one of the things I know when trying to publish a book is that the publishers will ask you, who are you aiming it at? So I'm kind of curious, who did you say you were aiming the Embodied Mind at?
I was aiming it at, I didn't use the word intelligent, but that's what I meant. I use some other word which doesn't come to my mind right now. But, you know, the well-read, intelligent, non-academic, who is interested in human development, in the human mind, in the body-mind connection, and just new ideas, both philosophically and spiritually, that kind of stuff. Yeah, yeah. But the main problem was to get an editor, because I had an editor in New York who unfortunately, not editor, sorry, literary agent, who passed away. So first I sent it to some of the editors that I had at Simon & Schuster, who edited The Secret Life of the Unborn Child. And totally to my consternation, he wrote back saying, we are at the moment not interested in publishing a book on genetics. Genetics? This is not about genetics. Yes, there was one chapter. There was one chapter on epigenetics, but the book is not about genetics. He totally misread the book. And it's these kinds of things that you're up against all the time.
Well, I mean, actually looking at the whole breadth of what you cover in the book is again, I just want to say, I think you've done such a beautiful work, and really on behalf of those who are doing the kind of therapeutic work where we're working with birth memories, where we're working with prenatal memories, this research feels to me very important. And you really look at cellular biology, you look at neurology, and as you say, genetics, epigenetics.
Yes. Yeah, and the impact of the mind on the body, and the impact of the body on the mind. Yes. Because you see, like, doctors for a long time have talked about psychosomatic medicine. So just observe the wording here, psychosomatic. So it's the psyche and then the soma. And what I'm trying to do, I'm not trying to denigrate the psyche. I'm not trying to say that the brain is not important. What I'm trying to do is to say that the body is equally important, that we need to have a more balanced approach to our humanity, the body-mind, the mind-body. You know, when we talked before we started, you suggested that you would like to ask me about sort of one study that really stands out in my mind, right? So with regard to that, well, there are several wonderful studies that just stopped me in my tracks. But one very interesting study, which is so relevant to psychotherapy and how we think about human beings, is this little study by Ellen Langer, a Harvard psychologist, on 82 hotel maids in New York. So interesting, because it's so simple. And it is so impressive. Like what she did was that she told one half of these 82 women, so 41 women, that the work that they did, in other words, cleaning rooms, was the equivalent to the US Surgeon General's recommendation for daily exercise. In other words, their work equals exercise. And the other 41 women were not told that. They were told something else that was not really relevant. After 1 month, they took sort of medical measures of both groups. And what they found was that among the 41 women who believed that what they were doing was exercise, they found a decrease in their systolic blood pressure. They lost weight, their waist to hip ratio decreased, and they had a 10% drop in blood pressure. And yet, in no way did their cleaning differ from what they did before. They just believed differently. They had a different belief system. And of course, that takes us, in all kinds of other directions. But it is so important. I cannot emphasize it enough. What your mind thinks, it is so important, your mindset. And I mean, for example, the placebo effect is another example of how what you believe will change your body, but also what happens in your body will change your mind. And there are lots of examples for that.
Yes, I mean, one of them which you give is the microbiome and how that affects the mind, which and that's a beautiful example, I think, of how these feedback systems are working in the body with the mind, and in a way, that's one of the things I really got from this whole concept of the embodied mind is that we're a network of feedback systems.
Yes, exactly. A network of feedback systems, all of them working not separately, but together at the same time. So you cannot separate them. It's all working at the same time. It's an incredible system. And perhaps the other thing that we have not mentioned, if I may, is about heart transplants.
Mm.
What was your impression about that?
I mean, that was something I was familiar with, the cellular memory of the heart, and of course, it makes perfect sense.
Yes. Yeah, I found that part of my research really interesting. When there were so many examples in the literature of how recipients of heart transplants change their personality to reflect the personality of the donor. Mm-hmm. And I think that is just such a good example of how cells carry memories. And again, there are very few. I have spoken to some cardiologists and they all shake their heads. And I said to one of them, well, have you ever mentioned to, one of your patients before or after you have done a heart transplant that there might be some changes in their personality? And they just shook their head and said, oh, no, I don't want to give them any false ideas.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we don't have enough research in that area because cardiologists are afraid that they will lose their reputation if they start going along these kinds of lines. You're just not allowed, so to speak. It's kind of a quiet censorship.
And also, I guess another influence on that is that people are working very specialized fields, but they're not necessarily communicating with each other.
Oh, that's another problem. That's a huge problem. Yes, sure. Cardiologists work just on the heart, and neurologists only work on the brain, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if they just, sat down once a month, perhaps, and have a dialogue with each other, they would learn so much more.
Well, that's again, I think, a wonderful thing about how you bring these things together. I mean, you include quantum physics as well. You touch upon things like near-death experiences, and of course, these are all things. These are things we see in the therapy room, and
yes,
and again, I think it's building a bridge between the therapists and the academics as well, which is part of I kind of feel like a renaissance going on.
Yes, absolutely. Cross-pollination. Oh, speaking of cross-pollination, can I tell you about one incredible experiment?
Please.
This is by Gene Robinson, University of Illinois. I think it is so, again, relevant perhaps to what's happening politically, socially. What he did, and you can only do this at university with students, what he did, he had students take something like 3,000 newborn bees from one beehive, which was the African killer bees. That's what they're called, African killer bees. Take 3,000 of these newborn little bees and put them into the beehive of European bees, which are much more gentle, and vice versa, 3,000 little bees from the European beehive into the African beehive. And then within a short time, he measured what happened to them both behaviorally and then also on a genetic level. And the amazing thing is that within a few weeks, the quiet sort of European gentle bees became just as violent as the killer bees into whose hive they were put. And the killer bees became much more gentle, being raised in the midst of European bees. But not only did their behavior change, but they changed genetically, so that genetically they became just like the rest of the beehive. Now, when you think of what that means in terms of humans, I mean, think of demonstrations, for example, okay? Think of large crowds. Think of what happened in Washington on January the 6th under Trump's leadership there. Some people who were perfectly nice to start with became vicious and aggressive when they became part of that crowd. And I think that it's the same phenomenon, that when you are in the midst of a crowd, genetic changes occurred in you, which then lead to behavioral changes. So here is another instance of taking into account the environment and the effect of the environment that it has on your genes, which can change from moment to moment. Again, something that most people don't realize. As we are speaking right now, Matthew, you and I, and everybody who is listening, many of our genes, not all our genes, but many of our genes are changing, not in terms of changing in their essence, but changing in terms of being active or being asleep. So it is the switches that are affected by the environment. That's where epigenetics comes in. So it's the methyl groups and the acetyl groups, which are called the switches, which are coordinated and affected by the environment. So as we speak, many of those switches are being switched on or switched off, and that will determine which genes are on and which are asleep, which then may perhaps put some people to sleep or not.
Well, the book is just full of all this kind of wonderful research, and there's so many directions I'm feeling I want to go with this conversation. But I'd like to open it up to see if anybody has some questions. So you can either put that in the chat, and Jules will let us know, or you can also raise your hand electronically. So any questions for Thomas, please? Make the most of having him with us, because it's a real honor to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So I recognize Mark Rackelman there has got his hand up. Maybe Mark, if you could ask your question.
Oh yeah, I'm happy to. Thank you. Thank you, Thomas, for this presentation. I was wondering, when I talk to friends or clients about cellular consciousness, do you have any model which mechanism is at work here? So how can we understand how consciousness works in a cell without any neural thing going on whatsoever?
You just gave away the answer. You see, neuroscientists and most people who study neurology or anything about the brain, they believe that neurons are different from other cells. This is not the case. This is not the case. Every neuron, first of all, developed from a regular cell, just to start with. But secondly, all the cells in our bodies work along very, very similar lines. And this has been established, by many excellent people. I have trouble remembering all the names, but Mike Levin, Mike Levin, who I know quite well at Tufts University. He has written. In my estimation, he is one of the best scientists living anywhere in the world. Mike Levin, an incredible guy. And he has shown that there's little fundamental difference between neurons and other cell types. It is now known that the synaptic proteins, ion channels, and gap junctions were already present in our unicellular ancestors and were being used by electrically active cells to coordinate their actions. Geneticists have shown that neurons evolved from far simpler cell types, and that some of the brain's speed-optimized functions were discovered around the time of bacterial biofilms. And in bacterial biofilms, it has been shown that bacteria, again, in a biofilm where they're working together as a network, will have the beginnings, you could say, a kind of primitive mind, primitive consciousness. So cells are really no different from neurons. Obviously, there is specialization. Your liver cells will be different from your cardiac cells, which will be different from neurons. But they all work along the same lines, and they are all able to retain information. And so when I speak of cellular consciousness, I don't mean to say that every cell in the body has consciousness. No, but as a network, they will provide consciousness. And the idea of consciousness, free will, and the mind are huge problems, philosophically, scientifically, religiously, whatever. It's a huge problem. I have been struggling with it for years. And I think that, the best that I can do at the moment with that is that all of these, free will, mind, consciousness, depend on this network between the brain and the body and all the cells and all the tissues, but it may be more than that. It may be more than that. I'm open to the possibility that there is something like a universal consciousness, something more spiritual that I really don't understand. But I suspect that it exists, and perhaps one of you, perhaps someone listening might throw some light on it. But this is the best I can do at the moment. But I just want to make sure, and that's a wonderful question, Mark. But I just want to make sure I'm not talking about each cell having consciousness. I'm talking about them working together.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you, Mark. And if there's anybody else, please raise your hand. And as we're waiting, I just wanted to ask you, because Thomas, you were saying how many papers and books you read to create the embodied mind, and it was a phenomenal amount. Can you remind me the number?
5,000, of which 500 are referenced in the book itself. So, if anybody wants to follow up on it, they can do so in the book. Yeah, it was, I must admit, a tremendous amount of work. And trying to get all the references correctly listed, it's a huge amount of work, because sometimes you just can't find them properly listed. It takes hours and hours and hours of work.
And I think that's I mean, some of that information I've been aware of before, but the way you really brought it together with a lot of really cutting edge stuff there. Again, it's Christmas time, folks, and this is time to buy the book.
Thank you. Yes, please do. Please do. Yes, and it's out in paperback now, so it's really not expensive.
Yeah, so yes, that's my plug for what really does feel like
Thank
a gift to us in the therapeutic community.
Thank you.
There's a question, Matthew, in the chat.
Yes.
Would you like to read it out, or do you want to read it, Matthew?
Jules, you read it out.
Okay, my question is, have you seen a difference between epigenetic markers at birth or in utero of the baby and the ones that happen in the adult? As you beautifully said, we are made of loops of feedback, and the interaction between what it is our body and the environment, and epigenetics is just at the beginning of itself. Does that make sense?
I'm not sure what the question is.
Well, there's a question to begin with, which is, have you seen a difference between epigenetic markers at birth or in utero of the baby and the ones that happen in the adult?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. Yes. I mean, those epigenetic marks change, like I said, all the time from moment to moment. So there would be some huge differences between, let's say, the epigenome, as it's called, of a newborn baby, and the epigenome of a 15-year-old or a 50-year-old. I mean, they change all the time. Robert Sapolsky in the United States has written a wonderful book, which is called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. It's a terrific title. And in it, he says, that 95% of our genome is taken up by these switches, the methyl and acetyl groups, and only 5% is taken up by genes. So he compares it to having a book in which 95 pages tell you how to read the other 5 pages. So yes, there's a constant changing of the epigenome as a result of the environment, and this is so important. I mean, like before epigenetics was discovered, and for a long time it had to struggle against sort of the establishment of geneticists who, like I said before, resisted change. But what is wonderful about epigenetics, which is now accepted, no one doubts it anymore. But what is wonderful for us as human beings and therapists and just plain, humanists, is the fact that our environment, and that includes us, how I think is also part of my environment, how we can willingly, consciously change what is going on in our bodies. Because if I expose myself, let's say, if I interact with people who are very critical of me, it's going to have a very negative effect on my genes. On the other hand, if I surround myself by people who are supportive and positive, my whole body, my health, is going to benefit from it. So we have choices. We have choices in terms of the kind of diet that we eat. All those things are choices. And because of epigenetics, we know that those choices are going to have an effect on us. Whether it's positive or negative, it's up to us.
And Tom, sorry.
Yes. Yeah. So the important thing is to realize that we are constantly a work in progress.
So it is almost like the old paradigm is saying we're these separate solid beings, whereas you're saying we're much more of an interactive process.
Everything is connected.
And
everything is connected. Yes.
Okay, thank you. There's another question. I think it's just coming.
Sure.
That's Mark again saying, are you aware of the Australian biologist Monica, I don't know if I pronounced this right. Mark, how do you pronounce it? Gagliano? On plant consciousness.
You don't pronounce the G. It's Monica Gagliano.
What does she do?
She's an Australian, Italian-born Australian biologist, and she's kind of rooted in both worlds. On the one hand, she does regular biological research on plants, and but on the other hand, she's doing lots of things with shamanism. So the funny thing is that the plants are giving her the designs for her research, and she's publishing this research in regular scientific journals. So, for example, she could show that peas have can be shown to have a Pavlov reflex, the same as a dog, and stuff like that. So it's a fascinating book, and it goes. I think you would love it because it goes very much along your lines. And
okay, could you send me the reference, please?
I'm happy to. Yeah,
Please.
send it. I don't know if I have your email address. I could send it to Matthew. I could pass it on to Matthew.
Send it to Matthew, please, and he will send it to me. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I just wonder, there don't seem to be many questions coming in. If there is anybody else before we finish today.
Well, I guess I've answered all the questions.
Well, I think you've certainly opened up this wonderful world of the human organism and beyond. I mean, there are so many questions I'd like to ask, but we don't have time. And
well, we can do this some other time. I'm always happy to speak to you, Matthew.
Well, I do want to really appreciate your generosity, and I know you've been a little unwell, so showing up and being here with enthusiasm for your subject, I think is very contagious.
Good.
So, yeah.
I really love this subject. Yeah, I don't, like I said, how many hours, days, weeks, months I spent on it, but I don't mind. It's like a pleasure. It's like, I guess, playing the piano or something. It's just something that I really, really enjoy because I enjoy learning new things and I like communicating about it to others.
Well, I think you're probably turning on those genes connected with enthusiasm, and they're all jangling away now. So Thank you. Oh, there is a quick question from Jules. What's your next book?
I don't think I'm going to write another book. I'm writing blogs on Psychology Today, which you can read. So far, I've written 50 blogs actually on Psychology Today, so you can easily find those. I am also writing a column for the Globe and Mail, which is the national paper of Canada, sort of the equivalent of the New York Times. So I'm pretty busy with those things. And, you know, I also like to play chess.
Well, I certainly know the amount of work it takes to create a book. And so I can imagine you probably had your fill for the moment.
I've had my fill. I've had my fill. Yeah. You said I've written several books. Actually, I think it's 8 or 9. I've lost track. Yeah.
And of course, many articles.
Yes. Yes. About 45. Yeah.
Any last words, Thomas, before we finish today?
No, I think that the important thing to remember is that everything is connected. You know, we are connected together, you know, as we speak. And it is so important to remember that, you know, everything is connected. And we have to, and the importance of replacing, you know, the old enskulled mind with the embodied mind, I think, is an important concept.
Okay, well, thank you so much. As always, it's always a great pleasure to spend time with you. So thank you.
Thank you, and good luck and goodbye, and continue what you're doing because it's important.
Likewise. Take care, Thomas. Goodbye, and thank you very much. And thank you everyone for attending, and Jules for hosting this. And we will make the recording available in some format or other. So thank you, everyone. Okay.
Thank you.